Okay, welcome back from our coffee break, virtual coffee break. We'd like to welcome Chris Martin as our next presenter. He is the head of access services at Loyola University Chicago Libraries. Besides managing access services, he works in coordination with other libraries, department heads, and branches on planning and executing projects and user-focused services. Chris, I'll let you know at the 20-minute mark if you don't pick up on it yourself, and we can do the questions then. That works for you.
Okay, sounds good. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to talk with you all today about user record management, which I don't know if passion would be the right word to use, but let's say it's been a strong interest of mine for the past several years. For sake of context, since access services can encompass a variety of different areas depending on the institution, I'll note that I'm currently responsible for audiovisual resources, circulation, course reserves, intercampus and interlibrary loan, and stacks management here at LUC Libraries. I'd like to begin with some background information about how I got involved with user record management. My first professional position was as the head of access services at North Dakota State University Libraries. So in 2013, NDSU migrated to Alma as part of Ex Libris's early adopter program for the new service platform. As you would expect, we had many major decisions to make during migration, and we had a lot of data to clean up to do as well. One of our cleanup decisions was to purge several thousand user records that we considered to be expired from our old system, which was Innovative Millennium. Our focus was on records that had expired on or before January 1st, 2010. This process went relatively smoothly overall. At LUC, about a year before I started here, so about mid-2015, we had migrated to Alma from Voyager. We undertook a similar user record purge project before we migrated, deleting about 41,000 records pre-migration. So what I want to underscore here is that these projects were really good and necessary, but as I would eventually learn, they weren't necessarily endpoints from a user record management perspective. So I'm not going to bury the lead today. The quote-unquote revolution I've been proposing for a while now is simply to incorporate regular purging as part of the user record management process. I'm posing this distinction in had been and should be terms. So in my past experience, purging had been part of a bigger systems project with a focus on immediate data cleanup, particularly tied to pre-ILS migration. I now think that purging should be a regular systems project, regardless of any other projects taking place, that there should be a focus on both ongoing data cleanup and user privacy protection, and that in doing this, there's a need to clearly define and standardize the purging criteria along the way. So if we frame purging user records in these should be terms, then I think the reasons for why we should care about purging become more clear. When we protect and dispose of users' personally identifiable information, or PII, we're helping ensure the right to privacy. I hope we can all agree that protecting privacy is fundamental to our daily work in libraries. As staff members, we also benefit. If we have fewer records with which to work in the system, then it's easier to manage not just the remaining user records that we have, but also fines and fees and other functions within access services as they relate to Alma. And finally, even if we remove self-interest and the best interest of users from the equation, we may have to purge records anyway. The reasons why can be, but aren't limited to, legal-based, campus-based, and are simply grounded within the priorities of our own organizations. So what are some you may have to examples? At NDSU, I started looking at purging on a regular basis in February 2016, which was about 6 months or so before I left to come to LUC. So this was when I discovered, quite by surprise one day, that the North Dakota University system had a retention schedule for circulation-related records, which at that time was 3 years plus the current fiscal year before you had to purge. The schedule has since changed to while active, but at the time it meant that I needed to not just purge several years worth of user records, but also establish a regular purge process to follow annually. This is the original impetus for why I'm presenting today. So at LUC, we drafted a privacy policy for the libraries a couple of years ago. There are no library-specific retention schedules at the university outside of financial ones, and we're a private university, so we're not bound to state records the same way. But we've decided to stick to a user record retention of 1 year plus current fiscal year, so we're a little bit more aggressive in this. Finally, I looked at SUNY's retention guidelines while researching for this presentation, and as best I can tell, there does not appear to be any pertinent designation in either the state or university schedules. However, library operations does cite circulation and use in IOL records separately as well. So there is a little bit of relation there. So let's say that you've decided it's a good idea to start regularly purging user records. Where do you actually start in this? The questions I've listed here are all useful to consider before you undertake the process. The gist that I want to convey here isn't just limited to these questions, but thinking in broad terms, you want to consider expiration and purge dates associated with your user records as one theme, user records to treat as exceptions as another theme, a third theme being your retention obligations from a quote-unquote have-to standpoint, a fourth theme being a pragmatic approach to regularly purging that will work for you long-term, and then finally, the data that you'll need to keep after purging or that you want to keep for your own organizational purposes. So Laura Guy is now working for Ex Libris as part of their customer service team. But back when she was the systems librarian at Colorado School of Mines, so this is about 2 or 3 years ago, she documented a patron purge workflow process that still remains incredibly useful. So, and I've provided a URL down below that you can see, but it's on the developer network if you search for it too as well. The internal workflow that I drafted and use at LUC is virtually identical to Laura's, though there's one significant update that I'm going to mention here in the next slide. I should also note that Laura's workflow and patron purging in general requires a lot of steps, time, and attention to detail. It is not a fast process. It centers on running analytics reports to determine a set of user records to potentially purge, cross-comparing those user records with a fines report in analytics to avoid purging anyone with an active fine balance, uploading an itemized user record set to Alma, and then running a job to standardize purge dates and user groups, and then finally purging the user records and checking the report for errors. It's possible to automate some of this process through the user's API. So this is something we still need to investigate at LUC, and I haven't looked into it too much so far. But for a documented example, please see Stacy Van Grohl's community knowledge article that I cite here, which does refer back to Laura's workflow as well. So the one exception I mentioned a minute ago concerns a new configurations option in the delete user policy settings in Alma, which Laura's workflow documentation does not reflect. I would also recommend that you choose keep statistics and remove primary ID as the policy setting, for this is going to prevent primary IDs from moving into the last name field of users after you purge records. I didn't discover this until relatively recently. So if you're like me and you've purged a number of records before already, and you want to switch the setting from the keep statistics setting to the new recommended one, note that while a job is supposed to run retroactively to remove the primary IDs from records you previously purged, this isn't actually working correctly at the moment. Ex Libris support has said they're planning to fix for the first quarter of this year. So far, I don't think it's happened, so I'm not sure if this is going to be for the March release or sometime later. So remember how I said that purging requires attention to detail? I want to emphasize how easily mistakes can happen if you're not careful when purging. And I think learning from mistakes is really instructive in cases like this. So in the interest of full disclosure, I've made at least 3 significant types of mistakes in working with purging user records in Alma for the past few years. The first type was soon after I started at LUC. While cleaning up some of the law library pseudo-patron user groups that we had, I inadvertently deleted over 150 accounts that I shouldn't have. This was because while Laura's workflow has you convert user records to a separate and distinct user group for purging, I did not do that, and I purged them directly instead from the law firm user group to which they originally belonged. So I didn't follow the workflow, and as a result, I had to recreate a lot of accounts by hand, as well as apologize to the law library, and I didn't note here that I did some swearing too as well. So I was kind of frustrated that day with myself. Um, More recently, I decided to save some time, as a second example, by processing and purging records from several different user groups instead of handling them separately. So the result was that over 650 records with errors or exceptions appeared in the purge job report. Because I converted all of these records to the purge user group that we use distinctively for purging user group patrons, I had to reconvert them back to their original user groups by hand because I needed to actually retain those records. So again, I didn't follow the workflow. Finally, it's generally a bad idea to delete records immediately from the Find and Manage user screen. And this is something that Ex Libris has noted and something that's been noted, including by me at SUNYLA before, because per Ex Libris, the statistical data associated with these records then disappears completely. I don't do this anymore, but I've done it before, and when I have, you get the idea of what I didn't do. So please be careful. So I have a couple of screenshots to share for purposes of illustration here. One of the first major steps in the patron purge workflow is to run a user management report in analytics to determine a set of user records to potentially purge. I recently worked on purging records that had expired on or before the end of FY18 or fiscal year 18 for us. So we run on a July through June fiscal year. So the end of fiscal year 18 was June 30th, 2018. So in the screenshot here, I was trying to determine purge eligible records within our School of Medicine staff user group. So during a purge process, typically I'll run this report for each of several distinct user groups, including for faculty, students, and alumni across our, what we call our lakeside campuses. So we have two kind of main campuses. We also have a law library and law school and a health sciences campus as well. So faculty, students, and alumni in all those groups are for what I'll run this for. The other major analytics process in this workflow is, as I mentioned earlier, to run a list of expired user records with fines and then cross-compare the results with results from the previous report. So the idea here is not to purge any record with an active fine balance, at least during the first pass-through. You may want to do this later, but first step is to not do that. So the user group filter you're seeing in the screenshot here is in order to eliminate our internal and pseudo-patron user groups from consideration, and also anyone that has any fines outstanding. So what might the results of regular user purging look like then? In our case, when I started this process in 2016, fairly soon after I arrived, we had around 61,000 user records in Alma. For sake of context, I mean, typically our overall active enrollment will be somewhere in the high teens, so around 17,000 or so. And it's burgeoned a little bit in the last couple of years with extra enrollment. Few thousand staff and faculty members too as well that are normally active at any given time. So 61,000 user records. Despite purging those 41,000 records in 2015, we still had records from 3 different integrated library systems stretching back well into at least the early 1980s. I'm going to freely admit that I had no idea what Notice was, so a side benefit was I learned more about ILS history along the process. The initial criteria were to purge records that were eligible, again, past 1 year plus current fiscal year, or that had autofill dates assigned to them like 12/31/1969, which usually indicated records from Notice. We retained any records with fines, lost books, and/or active loans. As a result, I was able to reduce our net total of user records in Alma down to around 41,000 as of the beginning of this last October. And that's when the real challenge began. We still had roughly 55,000 user records that were purge eligible under our criteria, and we have retained these because of outstanding fines. This number included many accounts that still had fines that were considered active in Alma per an analytics report, but actually had an active balance of $0 in managed patron services. So my approach was to keep retaining records that had service indicator transcript blocks, which I'm going to circle back to here in a second, as well as records above our old lost item replacement fee threshold, which was $35. It's currently $100 now. So, but it was time to try to purge everything else. So about the service indicator reports, an advantage at Loyola is that our ITS department has created and developed from scratch pretty much a data warehouse and business intelligence platform that's very powerful and it's relatively user interface friendly. I mentioned the transcript blocks, which we apply on active records with outstanding lost item fees to undergraduate and graduate students who have fines. We have to apply these blocks through an external system though, and we don't have a way to keep track of them in Alma. So the screenshot details the parameters of a report I run to determine user records with transcript blocks associated with them. And then use this report in much the same way as the analytics fine feet report I mentioned earlier in order to cross-compare and remove records with transcript blocks from consideration. So you might have gathered by now that while Alma Analytics is great in many ways, the reporting categories aren't that ideal for this sort of purge process that I've outlined so far. Besides what I've noted already, records with linked loans, which it appears as an error designation after you run a purge job in the report results, are not actually purgeable. However, there isn't a report category in analytics for a quote unquote linked loan, and it's not always the same thing as an active loan status per the fulfillment report subject area. And I discovered this by happenstance a few months ago. So, moreover, while analytics details fine information at what I would call an instance level or a per fine level, it's difficult to actually tell what the active balance is for a given user record as it appears in managed patron services, which I personally find a little bit more useful to get a better picture. So the result is that I had some false starts and many record errors during this round of purging. After some trial and error, I got us down to about 37,750 records remaining as of the beginning of October. As of a couple days ago, we're at 38,650 or so. About 1,500 of those records remain that are expired on or before the end of FY18, but have transcript blocks or lost item fees replaced to them, or lost item replacement fees associated with them. So in terms of next steps for purging, while we have a regular purge process in place at OUC, we don't want this to be the endpoint of where we take our user record management process. For one, it'd be good to establish a firmer timeline internally. I like to start purging eligible user records as soon after July 1st as possible, but that's also a very busy time for us in terms of annual reports, other administrative tasks, and prepping for the start of the school year. One option I've proposed is going through the process biannually, which we're still considering internally if we're going to do or not. We also see user record purging as an impetus for other privacy tasks. An example is that we have multiple shared department email accounts with PII associated with them in Microsoft Outlook, and we don't want to contain that information long term. So like one example is that if someone replies to one of the automated letters from Alma, the reply goes into a shared account that a few people see. So I've worked on a couple of occasions on deleting a lot of these emails by hand, but there's still more to do, and it's kind of a constant process. Finally, within access services, we've talked about changing our fine policies to eliminate or reduce a lot of our fines outside of lost item replacement fees. Chicago Public Library began a big Fines Don't Fly initiative late last year, in which I found personally inspiring and seems to have been very successful so far. So we may use that as kind of a model. So in terms of final takeaways, I hope I've conveyed in this presentation how important user record purging and user record management as a whole is to me. And we'll really emphasize here that we might think of this as typically being within the domain of systems departments, but my contention and the reason in part that I'm presenting today is that access services staff can and should be involved. Public services can really help with the valuable data cleanup project from which they also stand to benefit. I cannot stress enough how much I've appreciated collaborating with my systems colleagues on this, including Hong Ma, our head of systems, and Margaret Heller, our digital services librarian. I've already mentioned API usage and that we're going to investigate it a little bit more in the future. Finally, I also want to note that cleaning up your patron data is a really valuable privacy initiative. If you're migrating with or retaining legacy records that you could otherwise purge, particularly from previous ILSs, that's simply bad for privacy. Any questions?
And you are right at the 20-minute mark. Are you able to see the Q&A?
Let me see if I can here.
It should be at the bottom of your screen.
I don't think I can, no.
Okay, then I'll read them. I'll be happy to read them to you. I was under the impression that Alma would not delete a user record with active loans or fines and fees. Curious that Laura Guy's workflow would require checking against fines and fees.
So you can, with an active loan, you cannot delete pretty much no matter what. If you have fines or fees, in the purge process, when you run since I don't have it in front of me, I'm kind of riffing a little bit. But if you open the purge users job, then you have a fine waiver threshold. So you can choose at what point, like up to a certain dollar amount that you want to like waive accounts or keep accounts. So in Laura's workflow, she has you run it like at $1 or $0, I think. And so that way, like anyone under that like amount will be purged, but otherwise everyone else, or I'm sorry, everyone under that amount will, is that right? Do I have that right? Will be purged and everyone else will kind of stay. So I guess the idea here is that you want to be like as conservative as possible, I guess, the first pass through. And so there have been times like when I've run the threshold at like a higher amount, like that $35 amount, to purge out some kind of extra accounts. Like I did this like during kind of the second round I documented in October. But for the most part, like I try to be as cautious as possible.
Okay, so I think that also kind of answers the next question about whether Alma will purge patrons with fines and/or materials out.
Yeah, so materials out is pretty much a hard line for no. And that's where it's, again, a little bit frustrating in that, so when you run an analytics report, you can see what's called an active loan process. So if you run that as a report category, then it gives you kind of a yes, no as far as like if the patron account associated has active loans or not. And I don't know the reason for this. For some of the accounts, especially the historical ones, when I would run a purge job and get some errors, it would refer to linked loans, like the account would be associated with a linked loan, and that would not necessarily correlate with the active loan category. And it's something I want to follow up on with Ex Libris, but I haven't had a chance to yet.
Okay. Also in Voyager, that prior question came from somebody who was in Voyager. Purging patrons does not take out the stats on circulation. Are you saying that purging in Alma does?
That depends on the delete user policy setting. So if you look at the documentation for that setting, then that details like what stats are kept and what stats are not kept. So we try to purge out as much PII as possible, but we keep the historical loan information for obvious purposes.
Okay. Do you upload your patron data from other campus departments? For example, student data from registrars and faculty from HR? If so, what do you use as a match point to make sure that existing records are not overlaid?
We do. So we have a student information system integration so we run a daily sync job from that. ITS uploads the patron data file, which is based on registrar, but it's also based on our HR information site and a few other places too as well for faculty and staff. They'll open up the data file. Typically we'll run the sync at 10 o'clock every morning. It won't run on weekends, or it'll run like an empty batch, but it'll run like every weekday. And then we'll check the sync at that point for any errors of that sort. The way that we have it set, and again, like if you look at the settings for the integration, you can sort of see this more in detail, but we run a sync to merge patron records as best as possible based on primary ID. That's not always perfect in reality. Typically where we hit snags with duplicate records is if, for example, someone graduates and we have them as an alumni, typically we'll have their account as being internal. So in other words, like it's not managed by an external system and we internally update it with any information. However, if they go back to school or if they become an employee at Loyola or begin teaching at Loyola, they'll have an external account come through and it'll get bounced because the primary ID will read off of like whatever their internal account has. So whenever there are rejections, typically like I'll have to check anywhere from like once a month to sometimes daily to try to resolve those rejections as best as possible, and that requires some by hand work. There is a tool like in the last couple months that makes it easier to merge duplicate accounts. So I think that was in the December 2019 release. We haven't had to use that very much yet, but I know that when it comes around time for like the start of the academic year or the start of the summer, we're going to need to use that a little bit more.
Okay, the next question is your Alma. Does your Alma work in coordination with your bursar's office, or do you deal with the patrons directly? So are you interfacing with the bursar?
It does not, but we want to address this. So this is, so we have an Alma Primo steering committee, and like one of the tasks that that Hong in particular is trying to work on in conjunction with ITS and with the bursar's office is to try to do a financial system integration of some sort. So in the past, and I don't know if this is so much the case now, like in the past, if you had that integration with the bursar, you ran a risk sometimes of when you exported fines to the bursar system of zeroing out the active balance on the patron account. So I don't know if that's still the case now, but that was one reason to keep things separate from a bursar integration like back a few years ago. I think now there's a reason for us to try to do the integration. But ours is pretty decoupled. I mean, to the point where we, like all of our fine management and stuff is handled internally. So the only thing we really do that sort of relates to, you know, kind of bursar registrar side is what I mentioned with the service indicators, like applying those by hand. So we have talked about wanting to apply transcript blocks too as well to students, I mean, who have outstanding loss item fees, but we haven't gotten there yet.
Okay, a semi-related question, not necessarily tied to yours, is does Alma work with PayPal? And I don't know that off the top of my head.
Yeah, so we don't, I don't know if it works with PayPal. We do have an internal like payment system called ePay. And so we do encourage like users to use that to pay by credit card if need be. So they can also pay at the service points too, like at the circulation desks, but they can pay their ILL fees as well, like their ILIAD, like kind of overdue fees, like through that system.
Okay, can you explain what you mean by linked loan?
Yeah, so it's, I'll try to find an example. I've got the Q&A up, so I see your question now, Leslie, so I can follow up with you about that. It's like I'll have to generate like a report error to sort of mention the language for it, but it seems to be tied though to historic, like especially like legacy accounts like Voyager and Notice accounts, where the user in question like had a lost loan that's somehow connected to their account. It's not considered active within Alma, but if you try to like purge the record, even if it meets all the other criteria for purging, it'll end up as a rejection in the purge report, and it'll say that user is linked to an active loan.
Okay, and are your student data and faculty staff data from the same or different feed files and systems?
That's a great question. I wish I knew. It's one of the issues we've had. So we have a good relationship with the ITS. I do want to stress that. It's a good working relationship, and we've got a lot of different projects that we're working with them on. One of the struggles we do have, and it's not just with them, is to try to figure out exactly where our data is coming from. So we know that ITS, they're the ones that work with our patron feed in terms of uploading it and making sure our synchronization is working as we need it to. But as far as where they get their data, they're sometimes not even entirely certain. So some of it does come from Locus, which is our registrar system. Some of it does come from HR too as well. So we know, for example, that for like employees, like typically they won't show up in Alma until they have an employee ID signed by HR. But if I had to sit here and tell you like where all the data comes from, I couldn't do it. And I really want that answer. So it's kind of on my to-do list.
Okay, and your colleague posted in the panelist side that student data is from PeopleSoft and staff and faculty is from another system.
Oh, okay, all right. Thanks, Hong.
And there's one final question before we run out of time. Do your student records come with separate expiration and purge dates?
Yes, so For the expiry dates, they're set automatically based on what their user group is. So usually for students, it'll be set sometime after the end of the semester for which they're registered. And then once they register for the new semester, then it'll be updated by that point. For faculty and staff and for emeritus, now it's a rolling 1 year as long as they're considered active within the system. So if someone leaves Loyola, then their expiration date stops, and then they officially expire like a year after their departure. So purge dates, typically the newer accounts can be assigned them, but usually what we do is don't worry about them very much. Like, so for those analytics reports I run, I'll base them off of expiration dates, and then per Laura's workflow, I'll assign them purge dates later on to make them more uniform. So I'm less concerned about them, I guess, until it gets time to purge.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your presentation, Chris. We're so glad you were able to make it here to present today.